What language shall I borrow to thank thee, dearest friend, for this thy dying sorrow, thy pity without end? O make me thine forever, and should I fainting be, Lord, never, never let me outlive my love for thee. Won't you be seated, please? The sun had already set. It was too late to light the Shabbat candles, to bless the Passover meal when they left Joseph's tomb, the place where they had laid the tortured body of Jesus. The women, Mary, his mother, Mary of Magdala, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and the disciple that Jesus loved, had stayed at the foot of the cross all that time, waiting for him to die. There was nothing they could do. They were powerless over the Roman soldiers, and they were vulnerable to the crowd that had gathered to watch as the two thieves and Jesus hung there, waiting for their bodies to decide that they could no longer cope with the pain and with the suffering. And yet they knew they had to stay. It was the very least they could do, even though Peter and Andrew and James and the others had all fled. The leaden hours passed so slowly as they watched and they waited, as the soldiers and the crowd beat him and spat upon him and mocked him until he either bled to death or suffocated. If they could have, any one of them would have traded places with Jesus. No one deserved this violent, humiliating, torturous death, and certainly not Jesus. Her son, her nephew, her friend, his leader. What was it about the teachings of Jesus? What was it about his words and his deeds which so disturbed the wise and powerful of Jerusalem? Sorrow is the price paid for an outspoken advocate of strangers, of the poor, and all those on the margins of society. The men and women around Jesus at the hour of his arrest and trial were not innately evil people. They were not particularly sadistic or filled with naked hate. But rather, I think it was fear, rigidity, deceit, and for some, indifference. All of those things surrounded Jesus in the garden, before the Sanhedrin and before Pilate. And each person that Jesus passed made an individual choice. Each one was responsible for the choice that they made. It is the sum of the choices that are evil. These are the same choices which always lead to torment, to injustice, to persecution. Individual choices that, like stones thrown into a pond, create ripples that roll unstoppable in all directions. After he had died, after the soldier had pierced his side, after they had taken him down from Pilate's cross, The women did not realize that they were still waiting. What else was there for them to do but to wait? Perhaps they were waiting for their own pain, their own suffering from watching the violence, from their own sense of loss to become bearable. Perhaps they were hoping that God would intervene and suddenly give life to Jesus again. In this waiting time, the reality of his death began to sink in. They would have to face the truth. Jesus was dead. He had not merely passed out or fainted from the pain, but he had died. It was finished. Their hopes and their dreams for the kind of world he believed was possible for all people were finished as well. There was no future to fulfill the hopes of the past, and all their hopes for the future died on Pilate's cross and now lay in Joseph's tomb. Nothing else could be done until the Sabbath was over. Nothing but sit with a broken heart and remember all he had meant to them, all he had taught them, all of those amazing things that were unique to Jesus alone. It is truly impossible to face the agony of the death of Jesus and not feel the shame of deliberate, extraordinary cruelty to the human spirit. And we have been so vividly reminded of that just this week, that such cruelty, such choices happened not just in Jerusalem so many years ago, but in Brussels this week, in Paris, in Mosul, in Darfur, in Damascus, in Tehran, in San Bernardino, in Baltimore, in Sarajevo, in Palmyra, and Havana. In Jesus' trial of blood, we see what it means for God to respect the freedom that God has given to us. Exactly like each participant in the trial, the betrayal, and the suffering of Jesus, you and I are responsible for our own decisions. And when we turn away from the world's torment, tonight, as we tell the stories of Jesus living, the stories he told his disciples, the stories he told the crowd that gathered round, the story of his dying and his being laid in Joseph's tomb, we are recalling God's passionate love, which impelled God toward a new way. It is the story of love which is so great that God identified himself in total solidarity with our humanity, sending forth his only Son into the midst of the sin and suffering of the world to bring us back to God. It is the story of the collision of God's boundless love with fear, anger, oppression, and hatred. It is the story of God's steady, persistent faithfulness to the relationship that was, despite our defection, despite our waywardness, despite our choices. But I want to be very clear tonight. Jesus made his choices freely, not forced by God and not forced by man to confront the fear and the anger and the oppression. If his choice was not free, his solidarity with humanity, his intimate comprehension of our hopes and dreams and fears was not real, and his revelation of God's boundless love for us was not true. What we know now that they did not know then is that God stood by Jesus the whole time. That God has not let death have the last word. That God has chosen to identify with us and thus to suffer with us, to join us in our trials, to feel the searing pain and the powerlessness in the midst of darkness. God's response to us is to join us, to stand beside us, to walk with us in life's deepest sorrows. Jesus, whom we call the Christ, did not live in order to die. He lived to give the kind of life he offered so that others might have a quality of life. His arms extended on Pilate's cross was a consequence of his compassion and his mercy. The kind of death that he died was a consequence of the kind of life he chose to live. As the sun set, Jesus lay in Joseph's tomb, and God alone stood with him. May we, in silence and in the shadows of this sunset, hold before the Lord of life the one who taught us how to live.